Greeks. A people glorious and arrogant, valiant and headstrong. These were the men and women who laid the very foundations of Western civilization. Their monuments still recall perhaps the most extraordinary 2 centuries in history. A time which saw the birth of science and politics, philosophy, literature and drama. Which saw the creation of art and architecture we still strive to equal. And the Greeks achieved all this against a backdrop of war and conflict. For they would vanquish armies, navies, empires many times their size, and build an empire of their own which stretched across the Mediterranean. For one brief moment, the mighty warships of the Greeks ruled the seas, their prosperity unequaled. These achievements which still shape our world, were made not by figures lost to time, but by men and women whose voices we can still hear, whose lives we can still follow. Men such as Themistocles, one of the world's greatest military generals. Pericles, a politician of vision and genius. And Socrates, the most famous philosopher in history. This is the story of these astonishing individuals, of the rise and fall of a civilization that changed the world. BC, 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. In a town called Athens, a tiny city in mainland Greece, pandemonium ruled the streets. The ordinary people had turned on their rulers, demanding freedom from centuries of oppression. At this moment, one man looked on. An Athenian nobleman named Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes had been brought up from birth to be a ruler, to look down on these common people with contempt. But this one night would be a turning point. In his life, in the history of Greece, and in the history of civilization. In a flash of inspiration, Cleisthenes would see that these ordinary people should have freedom, a chance to shape their own destiny, to govern themselves. And with this decision, Cleisthenes would set his fellow Greeks on the path to empire. Historians estimate that Cleisthenes was born around 570 BC. He was hardly the type to become a man of the people, for he had been born into one of the richest families in Greece, his home a palace by the standards of the day. Cleisthenes' family were called the Alcmaeonids. They were a wealthy and long-established political dynasty.
He grew up in a world of great privilege, a world in which men of an elite background would expect to have certain privileges just given to them.
The origin of Cleisthenes' family fortune is a tale typical of ancient Greece. A curious story lost half in myth. The first Greek historian, Herodotus, claims that Cleisthenes' grandfather once performed a favor for a great king named Croesus, a king of immeasurable wealth. In return, he was told he could take a gift of gold dust from Croesus' treasury. But according to Herodotus, Cleisthenes' ancestor couldn't restrain himself just to loading up his pockets. He stuffed every orifice of his body, his ears and his mouth, with shimmering gold dust, and then poured more over his head and hair. And Herodotus writes that King Croesus was so amused by this bravado that he let him take all the gold he was carrying and as much again. But whatever the source of Cleisthenes' family wealth, there is no doubt that they had used it effectively to gain power. From his earliest days, the young Cleisthenes was taught that he was an aristocrat, ancient Greek for a member of the ruling class. In the 6th century BC, these aristocrats controlled everything that happened in Cleisthenes' hometown, a small settlement called Athens. Athens lay in the center of a Mediterranean peninsula which Cleisthenes knew as Hellas, and which we now call Greece. In the days of Cleisthenes' youth, it would have seemed impossible that this city would soon rule an empire.
It certainly is not what we'd call a city. Forget Manhattan. Athens in the center has public buildings, but otherwise I think one should imagine more village style of accommodation and habitation.
The town was built around the Acropolis, a steep-sided outcrop of bare rock, a stronghold from which the Athenians could fend off the attacks of their neighbors. In the narrow streets surrounding the Acropolis huddled the simple homes of farmers and tradesmen.
Most of the houses, perhaps mud brick. There was no sewage, there was no waste collection. We would find it very much like wandering through a third world village. You would certainly be able to smell Athens as you approached it.
For men, life was passed working in the fields or in basic crafts. Women spent their days cloistered in the home, cooking, spinning, weaving. For these Athenians, reading and writing was a rare skill. There was nothing that we might call science or medicine. Life expectancy at birth was less than 15 years.
I think the idea that ancient Greek life was nasty, brutish, and short would be entirely accurate. Certainly, life was extremely tough.